The room did not feel tense. That was the first mistake observers made later, when they tried to explain why no one stopped what followed. There was no raised voice, no visible dissent, no dramatic pause before agreement settled into the air. The atmosphere was procedural, familiar, the kind of setting where outcomes feel predetermined, not because they are inevitable, but because no one present believes deviation is necessary. The decision itself did not arrive with ceremony. It had been circulating for weeks in fragments, drafts forwarded without commentary, calendar holds labeled vaguely, side conversations that never quite solidified into opposition. By the time the formal meeting occurred, the choice felt less like an act and more like a confirmation of momentum already in motion. This is often how praised decisions begin, not with conviction, but with exhaustion. The organization was under pressure, though not the cinematic kind. There was no existential threat, no visible collapse, no public panic. Instead, there was drift. Performance had flattened, timelines had elongated, accountability had softened into consensus. The system still functioned, but its outputs no longer inspired confidence internally, even if external metrics remained intact. Leadership did not frame the moment as crisis. That language would have implied urgency, and urgency would have required ownership. Instead, the situation was presented as an alignment issue, a matter of efficiency, a refinement. The proposal promised clarity without confrontation. It reduced complexity on paper. It centralized authority just enough to appear decisive, but not enough to provoke resistance. It came wrapped in language that suggested inevitability rather than ambition. Phrases like streamlining, de-risking, and removing friction appeared frequently in the circulated documents. No one argued against those words. They were too abstract to oppose directly. The decision was approved unanimously, though unanimity in such rooms often signals something closer to resignation than agreement. The vote occurred quickly. There were nods, a few clarifying questions that did not challenge substance, and then a shift in posture, the physical cue that the group had moved on. The praise followed almost immediately. Internal communications highlighted the speed of alignment. Senior stakeholders complimented the clarity of execution. A brief was sent to external partners emphasizing discipline and focus. The decision was framed as evidence that the organization could still act decisively when required. For a short period, that framing held. Metrics improved in ways that were easy to display. Reporting lines tightened. Outputs appeared cleaner. Fewer voices slowed fewer processes. Meetings shortened. Decisions landed faster, even if they landed on familiar ground. From the outside, the move looked overdue. Inside, it felt quiet. That quiet was initially interpreted as success. Noise, after all, had been the problem, or so the narrative suggested. Fewer objections meant alignment. Fewer delays meant efficiency. The absence of friction was taken as proof that the system was finally functioning as intended. What went largely unremarked was what else disappeared. One department, previously informal but influential, lost its seat in the room. The change was procedural, justified as a reporting adjustment rather than an exclusion. No announcement marked it. Their calendar invites simply stopped arriving. A senior manager who had once challenged assumptions in meetings shifted tone noticeably. Their contributions became shorter, more neutral. They stopped circulating counter memos. Within 6 months, they accepted an offer elsewhere. The departure was amicable, praised as a natural transition. No one connected it to the decision. An internal memo from that period, circulated quietly following the Q3 governance review and attributed to the Risk Alignment Subcommittee, contained a line that was easy to overlook at the time. Given the revised governance structure, escalation pathways may need to be reconsidered in future cycles. The sentence carried no urgency. It was buried in the middle of a technical update, but it was the first recorded acknowledgement that the decision had altered not just authority, but visibility. Escalation, once removed from daily practice, does not announce its absence until it is needed. The decision worked. That is not in dispute. It delivered what it promised in the narrow frame through which it was evaluated. Speed increased, control consolidated, accountability appeared clearer, even as responsibility became more diffuse. The cost emerged elsewhere. Trust did not collapse. That would have been visible. Instead, it thinned. People stopped assuming disagreement was welcome. Silence increased, not as protest, but as adaptation. Contributions shifted from exploratory to confirmatory. The organization did not become less capable, it became less curious. Optionality suffered quietly. By narrowing who could speak and when, the system reduced its own ability to detect deviation early. Signals that once surfaced informally were now filtered through layers that prioritized coherence over accuracy. Nothing broke immediately. That was the danger. The first formal review that noted a degradation in cross-functional signaling did not occur until the second planning cycle the following year. A year later, when conditions shifted externally, market dynamics changing in ways no single department controlled, the organization responded slowly, not because it lacked intelligence, but because it lacked practiced dissent. The muscles required to challenge prevailing assumptions had atrophied. Attempts to raise concerns felt disruptive rather than constructive. The cultural memory of disagreement had faded. When delays began to reappear, leadership searched for operational explanations. Processes were reviewed, tools were upgraded, consultants were engaged. None of those interventions addressed the structural quiet that had been engineered earlier and praised at the time. The decision's defenders pointed to its initial success. They were not wrong. The data supported them, but the data no longer captured what had been lost. This is where many modern readings of Machiavelli falter. He wrote extensively about decisiveness, about the necessity of appearing resolute, about the dangers of hesitation, but he was also acutely aware of context. His warnings were not universal endorsements. They were observations rooted in specific power arrangements, fragile coalitions, and volatile environments. What is often borrowed is the posture, not the constraint. Machiavelli understood that decisiveness without volatility does not produce strength. It produces rigidity, a condition his modern interpreters rarely acknowledge. In this case, the posture of decisiveness was adopted without the surrounding conditions that once made it survivable. The organization was not facing rebellion. It was not contending with rivals poised to exploit delay. It was managing complexity, not chaos. The decision borrowed the language of strength from a context of threat and applied it to a system suffering from stagnation. The immediate effect looked similar. The long-term consequences did not. In organizations with less accumulated trust, similar consolidations did not produce alignment. They produced resistance, delay, and exit, outcomes documented later, but rarely connected back to the original decision logic. Even within the original institution, attempts to repeat the maneuver failed. Subsequent efforts to centralize further met quiet obstruction. Compliance replaced engagement. Implementation slowed despite formal authority expanding. The context had shifted. The tolerance for consolidation had been consumed by the first decision. This is the decay Machiavelli understood, but modern adaptations often ignore. Power moves exhaust the conditions that make them effective. There is an additional irony rarely acknowledged. The very praise that followed the decision made future correction more difficult. Public celebration hardened the narrative. Admitting costs later would have required undermining the story of competence. Leadership had already told about itself, so the consequences were managed indirectly. Attrition was reframed as evolution. Slower adaptation was attributed to external volatility. The original decision remained untouched, insulated by its early success. In a private conversation years later, a secondary actor, present in the original meeting, but absent from most accounts, described the moment differently. It felt clean, they said. Too clean, like we had solved a problem by removing the evidence it existed. That observation never appeared in writing. The file, if one were to close it honestly, would not list a failure. It would list a trade. Speed purchased with range. Clarity purchased with resilience. Silence purchased with predictability. The decision was praised because its costs were deferred, distributed, and difficult to attribute. By the time they surfaced, they belonged to the system, not the moment. And so the record remains intact. The decision stands as a success in retrospective summaries. The damage remains embedded, no longer traceable to its origin. Nothing dramatic follows. No reckoning arrives. The organization continues, altered in ways that feel natural to those who join later and disorienting to those who remember before. The consequence is still unfolding. The praise remains on file,